The ride I wish I never took. There are moments in life when we make quick decisions, not realizing how much we'll regret them later. That's what happened to me one late afternoon when I made the choice to accept a ride from a stranger. I wish I could say it was the kind of thing you'd expect, just a weird vibe or awkward silence, but this was different. This was something that shook me to the core, and even now, as I recount this, I still feel that knot of fear in my stomach. It all started as a normal day. I had just finished some errands and was walking down a quiet road, far from home. My phone battery had died, and I didn't have any way to call an Uber or even check the bus schedule. It was getting dark, and the area wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be stranded at night. I started considering my options when I saw a car slow down as it approached me. It wasn't an old, beat-up car, but it wasn't new either. A man, probably in his late 40s, was driving. He rolled down the window and asked if I needed a lift. I hesitated, but I was tired and desperate to get home. The man had a kind face, nothing threatening. In my mind, I ran through the usual warnings about accepting rides from strangers, but I pushed those thoughts aside. It's funny how, in moments like that, you convince yourself that everything will be fine, that those bad things only happen to other people. So, I got in. At first, everything seemed fine. He was polite, asking the usual questions, where I was from, what I did for work. It felt like small talk, nothing out of the ordinary. But after a few minutes, I noticed something. We weren't heading in the direction I thought we should be going. I asked him about it, and he casually explained that he was taking a shortcut. I wasn't familiar with the area, so I couldn't argue, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. The further we drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. Trees lined both sides of the road, and the sky was quickly darkening. The GPS, if I had one, would have probably warned me that this wasn't a shortcut at all, but I had no way of knowing. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to show it. Instead, I tried to act calm, thinking that if I kept talking, I could maintain control over the situation. I asked him about his job, and he responded with vague answers. He said he worked here and there, nothing specific. He didn't ask about me anymore either, as if he had lost interest in the conversation. His eyes, though, kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, just quick enough that I could catch him doing it. It made me uncomfortable, but I still tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Then came the moment that made my blood run cold. He slowed the car down, pulled off to the side of the road, and stopped. There was nothing around us, no houses, no lights, just trees and the road stretching out into the darkness ahead. I asked him why we were stopping, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Finally, he turned to me and said, "I need to check something in the trunk." His tone was off, flat, almost emotionless. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to get out of the car and run, but there was nowhere to go. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea how far away the nearest town or even the next house was. I watched him get out of the car and walk to the back. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my instincts were screaming at me to do something. I quickly scanned the inside of the car, trying to figure out my options. That's when I noticed the doors didn't have the usual manual locks. They were electronic, controlled by the driver. Panic started to set in. I knew I needed to get out of there before he came back. I glanced out the window and saw him fiddling with something in the trunk. He wasn't in a rush, which made it even worse. It felt like he was taking his time, knowing there was no way I could get away. I reached for the handle, praying that the door would somehow open, but it didn't budge. Locked. Just then, he slammed the trunk shut. The sound of it echoed in the quiet, and it made my heart skip a beat. He walked back towards the car, slower this time, like he was savoring the moment. I didn't wait to find out what he was planning to do next. I slammed my hand against the window, yelling at him to let me out. He stopped for a second, as if he was surprised, but then his face twisted into a grin, something that still haunts me to this day. I don't know what came over me, but I started kicking the door, hoping to break it open or at least get his attention in a way that would make him think twice about whatever he was planning. I could hear him laughing, a low, creepy laugh, like he was enjoying watching me panic. In that moment, I thought about all the stories I had heard about people disappearing, about bodies being found in remote places. I had never imagined that I could end up as one of those stories, but here I was, trapped in a stranger's car, miles away from anyone who could help me. And then, just when I thought it was all over, I heard a car approaching. Its headlights cut through the darkness, and the man's expression changed. He looked back at the approaching car, clearly not expecting anyone else to be on this road. Without a word, he jumped back into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off, leaving the other car in the distance. I don't know why he didn't do anything. Maybe he got spooked, or maybe he was waiting for the right moment, but either way, I didn't care. I was alive, and I wasn't going to wait around to see what he had planned next. As soon as we hit a busier road, I demanded that he pull over. I didn't give him a choice. I screamed, shouted, and hit the window until he finally relented. He stopped near a gas station, and I jumped out, not even bothering to look back. I ran inside, and the clerk must have seen the terror on my face because he didn't ask any questions. He just let me stay until I could figure out how to get home. That night changed me. I don't accept rides from strangers anymore, and I always make sure my phone is charged before I leave the house. I don't know what would have happened if that other car hadn't come along, but I'm grateful that I'll never have to find out. Sometimes, the most mundane decisions can lead you down a path you never expected, and if you're not careful, you might not make it back. The ride I should have avoided. There are moments in life that seem insignificant at first, but can turn into life-altering experiences. One afternoon, I made a choice that would haunt me for a long time. I accepted a ride from a stranger, and it was a decision I came to regret deeply. This wasn't just any ordinary ride. It became an unsettling journey that left me shaken. I was walking along a lonely road, feeling the weight of the day on my shoulders. My phone was dead, and I was miles away from home. As dusk began to settle, I saw a car approach. It was an older model, not one that stood out, but the driver seemed friendly enough. He waved and asked if I needed a ride. At that moment, I felt a mix of desperation and hope. I hesitated for a second, but ultimately, I climbed into the passenger seat. Initially, the ride was uneventful. The driver, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, chatted amiably. He told me stories about his life, his job, and his family. I thought I could trust him, but as we drove deeper into unfamiliar territory, I started to feel uneasy. The road became increasingly deserted, and the friendly demeanor of my driver began to feel forced. After a while, I noticed we had left the main road. My instincts kicked in, and I asked him where we were going. He smiled but didn't answer directly. Instead, he assured me that he knew a shortcut. I looked out the window, realizing how dark it had become. The trees were thick on either side of the road, and I could barely see the sky. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and a knot formed in my stomach. As we continued driving, the atmosphere shifted. The conversation dwindled, and I felt the man's gaze on me more frequently. I tried to keep the conversation alive, but he seemed distracted, his mind somewhere else. Suddenly, he took a sharp turn off the road, and my heart dropped. The car bounced along a gravel path that twisted into the woods, and fear flooded my senses. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me and said, "Just a little further." His tone sent chills down my spine. I looked around, searching for any sign of civilization, but all I saw were trees closing in around us. Without warning, he pulled over and turned off the engine. My heart raced. "I need to make a quick stop," he said, a strange smile creeping across his face. Panic set in. I had no idea what he meant by that, but the unease I felt was palpable. I glanced at the door handle, but before I could react, he got out of the car and walked toward the woods. In that moment, I realized I was alone with a man who had taken me to a deserted place. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to escape. I waited, my breath shallow, listening to the sound of my racing heart. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of the man. He was far enough away that I might have a chance. Summoning every ounce of courage, I quickly unlocked the door and flung it open. I bolted from the car, running into the opposite direction of where he had gone. The darkness enveloped me, but I didn't look back. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I pushed myself to run faster, fueled by adrenaline. The path was uneven, and branches whipped against my skin as I navigated through the underbrush. I could hear his footsteps behind me, closing in, and it spurred me on even more. The fear coursed through me. I knew I had to find a way out. In the distance, I spotted a faint light, my beacon of hope. With every ounce of strength, I sprinted towards it. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin with lights on. I knocked frantically on the door, praying someone was inside. An elderly couple answered, their faces filled with concern. I stumbled inside, breathless, and they quickly locked the door behind me. I explained everything, and they immediately called the police. I was terrified, shaking uncontrollably. They reassured me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. The couple offered me tea to calm my nerves, but my mind was still racing. I had narrowly escaped a situation that could have ended very differently. When the police arrived, I told them everything I could remember about the man and the car. They assured me they would do everything possible to find him, but part of me knew I was lucky to be alive. After that night, I never took a ride from a stranger again. It was a hard lesson learned, but I was grateful for the elderly couple who took me in and for the courage I found in that terrifying moment. Sometimes, we think we can handle anything, but there are situations that remind us to trust our instincts and value our safety above all else. That night remains etched in my memory, a reminder that not every seemingly harmless decision leads to safety. If only I had listened to my gut from the start, I might have avoided that dark path entirely. Reflecting on that terrifying night, I realized that what could have been just a simple ride turned into a valuable lesson about the importance of listening to our instincts. Often, we underestimate the dangers that can lurk in everyday situations, thinking we are immune to them. However, this experience taught me to be more cautious and to prioritize my safety above all else. Today, whenever I walk down unfamiliar streets or encounter a stranger, I remember that night. The fear I felt still resonates within me, but it also brought an unexpected strength. I learned that, while the world can be frightening, we can always find ways to protect ourselves and ensure we are not just spectators in our own lives. Since then, I've never hesitated to decline a ride offered by a stranger. Life is too precious to take such risks. Now, whenever I face a decision that seems simple, I ask myself, is it worth it? And with that, I move forward, wiser and more cautious.